Hi, Mark Slauter, here to do my book review for Anne Rice's book, Prince Lestat and the Realms of Atlantis. As you can see, I'm dressed in red, and of course I'm protecting my neck. Can't be hanging out with vampires and not protect yourself in some sort of a way. For those of you that are diehard Anne Rice fans, regardless of what I say, you're going to read this book. And if you're a diehard fan, you will come across a lot of old familiars. Gabriella, Pandora, Louis, Magnus, Marius, Armand. It's interesting for those of you who really follow this, the guy that made Lestat, Magnus, who tossed himself on pyre and said, "Scatter my ashes," he's in here as a ghost. And the way that Anne sets this up is in the previous book, which I didn't know that there was one that preceded this until I was almost done with this. In the previous book, I'm going to presume that both Macaire and Maharet have died. Amel is now being hosted by Lestat. Lestat and the elders have decided they're going to establish a court of the undead, or a vampire court. She doesn't really explain that, or title it rather, in the book. And so he and all these folks have gone back to his ancestral castle, and they've brought in all these architects to recreate the town. They're building furniture, they're making tapestries, people are painting murals on the walls and on the ceilings and all this other stuff. And in the book, what this really gets down to is there is a new species that the vampires find, and they kind of find them by accident. The first one that's mentioned is named Derek, and Derek is being held hostage by a vampire named Roland, and Roland shares his hostage with a much older vampire, Roshamandes. Now, the interesting thing about Derek is that these vampires can suck out all his blood and Derek doesn't die. So that's kind of an interesting twist. And as we go through the book, Derek is not the only one of his species. There's also Girakin and Capetria, who also has a friend. So there's 4 of these new species. So what Anne does in the book is she is obviously trying to explain their history, give them their backstory. And it's interesting. She brings some off-world element to this. She makes an attempt to recreate Atlantis and all the things that it had. And the link here is that these 4 creatures know Amel, and they want Amel back. The problem is that when Anne gets into describing Atlantis for these four new characters, it's really overkill. It's like 150 pages that probably could have been done in half of that. And she gets wrapped up in trying to explain all of the technology that we know today was already in Atlantis, as well as technologies that we don't have. So I feel that the story gets bogged down in trying to cover all of what Atlantis had. There's some interesting pieces to it, but it kind of gets bogged down. So as the story progresses, these new species want to meet with the vampires. And at one point, Roshamandes lops off the arm of the hostage Derek. And what's interesting is that by doing that, and what Derek didn't know, was that arm actually forms a body. So that's kind of a cool thing. For those of you, I hope none of you have lost a limb or anything, toes or fingers or anything, but if you did, it just sprouts up as another you. It's a little weird, but I like it. That's kind of cool. But I do think that it was definitely bogged down in talking about Atlantis. So now it comes down to that these Replomoids are meeting with the vampires, Lestat and the elders, and they sort of come to agreement. But the vampires are very scared of the Replomoids because obviously you can suck them dry and they don't die, and they're strong enough to kill vampires. But Lestat decides to say, look, we're going to respect them. It's a new species. We expect respect. So we're going to respect them, let them go do their thing. But they know that they're trying to find a way to get Amel out of Lestat. So in the meantime, the vampires are trying to think, how do we get Amel out of Lestat? Because if you remember, when you're part of the undead in Anne's series, they're all connected to a root, and Amel is that root, which he first took full-blown root, I'll say, in Queen Akasha. And whatever she did, if she went out and stood in the sun too long, all of the younger vampires, poof, up in flames. What's interesting is Lewis figures out a way to deal with that, basically cutting what she says is the silver cord. So she figures all, Lewis is the one that figures all that out, and it works. Then as we get to the end of the book, Lewis and Lestat are sitting in a cafe in Paris, and here comes Amel in a new body. And it's about 5 pages of a love fest between Lestat and Amel in his new body. I'm thinking to myself, no, this is not Lestat. I grudgingly give this a 3 out of 5 stars because I usually really enjoy Anne's writing, the information she gets into and presents, and the detail and the depth of characters. But in this, I got to tell you, I walked away from this, actually I didn't, I just put the book down. I felt like Lestat had been neutered in some form or fashion. So, even though I give it a grudgingly 3 out of 5 stars, bear with me. One must have the appropriate tools when dealing with vampires. Spike, hammer. Okay, that takes care of Lestat. And I hate to say it, but based on this book, it's time to put this puppy to rest. Let Lestat go into stasis, in a coma, some way, somehow, some fashion. And that's all I have to say. Have a great day, and keep on reading.